I want to say the lid is coming off. All right, whatever's been a lid on you over the past, I'm going to go as far as saying 30 years or so. If you've had a lid on you in terms of some things in your soul, coming into yourself, coming into who you really are, the lid is coming off, friends. It's time for us to let the ballast go, unpack the baggage, get some of the things that maybe we've been dragging with us for 30 years or more through a season of our life. The season is changing and it's time to let that go. So we're going to kind of talk about that a little bit today. So this message, if you want to call it that today, is called Small in Your Own Eyes. And the example that I'm going to give, the first example, is from 1 Samuel 15. You may be familiar with this story where it's talking about Saul and Samuel. Saul has just been anointed as king, and he's given an instruction as they go to battle. All right, he's given an instruction through the prophet Samuel. He's given God-given guidance, but he doesn't follow through. It has a serious ripple effect and eventually costs him the kingship. So here's Saul presenting his sort of abridged version of the story to Samuel of why he missed the mark. There's a little man-pleasing element going on in there. Man-pleasing is deeply rooted in insecurity. How many of y'all are recovering man-pleasers? We're going to talk about that today, and here's our big clue. Samuel says to Saul in the next verse, although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel. Wow. The New Living Translation says, although you may think little of yourself, are you not the leader? The English Standard Version says, though you are little in your own eyes, are you not the head? Even though you consider yourself of no importance, in Good News Translation, you are the leader of the tribes of Israel. Oh my goodness, what an amazing clue to Saul's defensiveness, his avoidance, his blaming behavior, his not taking full responsibility. The deep insecurities involved in man-pleasing show up there, and Samuel puts his finger right on it. You see yourself as small in your own eyes, unimportant, little. Small here in the Hebrew is katan, and it means small, young, unimportant, insignificant. Wow. These things, if they're not dealt with on the inside, lead to man-pleasing. They lead to us not using our voice. They lead to us deflecting responsibility for outcomes in our lives. Where does this meet us in our everyday life? So Samuel is essentially, if we do the nutshell version, he's saying, you were once this, but did you not become this? Or you may not think you're important, but the Lord chose you. Or you may think little of yourself, but are you not the leader, the responsible one? And the question for us today is this: are we living out of who we once were, or are we fully living out of who we've become, who life has caused us to become? And therein, there's a mixture in us often, which leads to confusion. It leads to a breakdown of clarity. And that prevention, that's the ballast in the hot air balloon that prevents us from coming up into the higher places where we're accessing the mind of Christ and we're confident about who we are. We're ready to say today, no mixtures, no excuses, all right? Let's get into this so that we can be healed and whole. So I want to say this to us because we're going to get down into the nitty-gritty of it together today. Perhaps Saul was grown in stature physically. He's actually said to be tall, but he still looked out on life as an insignificant and unimportant child, because old wounds and old experiences in childhood, in our growing up, in our formative years, create beliefs, don't they? They create the default operating systems within us, and before we even realize it, we're operating out of those subconscious headquarters, so to speak, in our souls. So it's very possible that though Saul had this fabulous stature, he was given the kingship, but he's peering out at life still with that childhood wound, and he's still seeing himself, he's still acting from that insecure, unimportant, insignificant place. And here's the thing we have to remember, because it applies to every single one of us. Kids don't have the tools to process things accurately, right? If they see their parents breaking up, they see it as their fault. If they experience a loss of life, all right, they see it as abandonment or not being wanted. They just don't have the cognitive ability to process neglect or shaming or harsh, disconnected discipline or abuse, cultivate deep-rooted inadequacies or fears of speaking up. Wherever we get, this is not just me saying this, this is, psychology 101, but wherever we get stuck developmentally, we tend to repeat the cycle until we get unstuck, yes? And so what we're here to do is to learn dominion. We're called to dominion, right? To subdue, to have dominion and mastery over that aspect of our being and our development. When we talk about the call, the commission to dominion and rule and cultivation and subduing the earth, it's not just about being a good gardener. It's about mastery over the very vibration of our earthly substance. Right? And that's why we're going to keep repeating the lesson until we get unstuck and we elevate and come up into a higher place of understanding about who we are, identity. Many people are all grown up on the outside, but stuck and operating, trying to unstick from a childhood wound. I mentioned this in a post, but it was so powerful. I saw the movie Rocket Man a couple of weeks ago with my kids out there in Nashville. And what a brilliant depiction of a full-grown man who was still stuck in his childhood woundedness of not feeling loved, not feeling lovable. And I'm going to use a word that Mark Groves used yesterday. He spent so much of his life painfully, listen to this, subcontracting the work of loving himself and caring for his own well-being to others. But the problem was these others kept repeating the behavior of his parents and kept reestablishing to him, I'm not loved, I'm not lovable, I'm unwanted, and that lack of affirmation. How many of us have spent too long subcontracting, to use Mark Groves' phrase, the work of loving ourselves to somebody else and getting disappointed over and over again? And there's this just brilliant moment where it mirrors the beginning of the movie, where he is a young child. He's still Reggie White, I think it is, at that point, and he says to his dad, when are you going to hug me? He's sort of invisible to his parents. They're aware that he has a gift, but his father is wounded too and cold and unloving, and his father looks at him and says, don't be soft. And this Reggie, this young unloved child, has no ability to love himself at this point, doesn't know how to embrace and love himself, looking to his parents to do that. Now hold on to that thought, because that's very important for what we're going to go to in a moment. And then it goes through the whole of life, subcontracting this work of loving himself, embracing and accepting himself out to other people who continually abuse him, almost to the point where he, wants to take his own life. In fact, at one point he says, I want to be somebody else, the ultimate in self-abandonment and self-rejection. I want to be somebody else. He, we see that in the costuming and what have you, gets to a point later on in rehab and has this moment where he sees his inner child standing before him, who says to him again, at this point of awakening in his life, says to him again, when are you going to hug me? And this time, he stops subcontracting the work of loving himself and loves himself, accepts himself, takes responsibility for his own insecurities, for his own outcomes in life, and begins the road of victory from a place of power, because he's now taking the role of loving himself, aligning with the unconditional love of God towards himself. Can you see how powerful that is in healing those childhood wounds that still keep showing up in our patterns of behavior on and on and on until we get those fixed? So I want to say this, that earthly family of origin experiences cause us to develop these grooves, right? These deep-rooted core beliefs that we just repeat in various different ways. So I want to say this, that people who suffer spiritual abuse, all right, do the same. Hang with me here, because I know there's some of you who are watching who are waking up to the fact that you have experienced spiritual abuse, or perhaps you're in it right now and you don't know how to unmesh yourself from the situation. But we sometimes subcontract our well-being and our sense of wanting to belong, especially if we've had bad upbringings or experience, much like Reggie White did. We subcontract that to people who they themselves have put an image on God as a dysfunctional parent in the sky. And God is not narcissistic, and God is not codependent, and neither do we need to be either. And so we say, then it gets all the worse when we say that our church or our religious group is our family when it's dysfunctional. Because those of us who are walking around in our unhealed childhood woundedness are like a moth to the flame, because we really want to belong, right? Can you see that happening? So it's essential, if we're going to truly coming into our genuine awakening experience and experiencing God's fullness and love, we're going to have to do this soul work, this healing from these family origin beliefs, so that we can fully embrace our spiritual family of origin. That's why I'm doing it this way before my book comes out in January, where I'm going to talk about true spiritual origin, right? And essence and core purpose. So we're going to be ready for that, and it's going to be beautiful. All right, so how then do we stop living reactively out of these defaults? All right, we need to learn to recognize when we're having reactive childhood wounding behavior patterns going on in our life, why we keep going round the mountain, getting back into old toxic behavior. This is the time right now. This season is going to be the breaking moment. The walls are coming down. We're going to learn to love ourselves. And here's what we can do. Very simple, but very effective. We must learn to wake up and be conscious, to notice our thoughts, notice the feelings that we're having, so that we can choose a better feeling thought. We can choose a better response. We can choose the adult in Christ response, not the wounded child response. And we're going to learn to wake up to recognize quickly fear, fight or flight, patterned reactions by the things that we feel. We have really dismantled the power of our God-given emotions for a long time. They're not to be followed or ruled over us, but they're also not to be suppressed, because they can be a guidance system for us. They can show us when we're the car going off the road on the bumps, right? And our body signals, we need to learn to wake up to our physical body signals that show that we're in reaction or trigger mode, right? Do we want to exit the room? Do we move into avoidance? Does our chest get tight? Do our legs go quivery and weird? Do we have shortness of breath? Does our stomach twist? Do we begin to get a headache? Do we feel panicked and anxious? And all of the subtler versions of that, right? Bad sleep, etc. And we need to stop and ask ourselves, stop still. Stop, drop and roll. No, stop, drop and ask. Stop and ask. What are these feelings telling me? Am I fearful? Am I alarmist? Am I uncomfortable? Is it perhaps likely that my inner child that's not healed is feeling threatened right now? So let's go back to Saul. He didn't hearken to divine guidance. Yes, he listened instead to the outside voices around him to keep their favor. Why? That's the question we need to ask. Why did he not listen to the divine guidance? Why couldn't he follow through? Why did he yield his power to those around him to keep their favor? Maybe he was ridiculed as a kid for not going along with the crowd. Remember, he's small in his own eyes. He's insignificant. He's unimportant. He's seeing himself like a child, even though he's the king. Maybe he was called names. Maybe he was laughed at for his puny size. So now, even though he's tall and handsome and the king, he hasn't embodied it. But he's not embodying who he actually is. And he's probably still, as we said, peering out through childhood wounded eyes, especially if he feels coerced or threatened by the boys, right? And we have to ask ourselves when we experience these same things, what is the root? What is the default belief subconsciously driving the ship? Because there is one. Steps. Okay, let's just quickly go over the steps to deactivating unwanted beliefs. First of all, we're going to identify unhealthy, negative, demeaning cycles, communication, patterns, or negative fruit, right? You know when you'll keep sowing the same thing because it keeps showing up in your life. Very simple. We talked about that, sowing and reaping. It applies to everything. The second one, recognize. All right, so we've got number one, you might want to jot these down. Number one, identify. Number two, recognize the physical feelings of response and emotion. Just not try to fix them. Just recognize. Just become aware of what's actually going on. Stop and ask, right? Stop and recognize. Anger, despair, sadness usually comes with a physical feeling as well, a twisty tummy, a stress in the shoulders, right? It's a lot of that is going to be from triggers, from what I call emotional aftershocks. Just like with an earthquake, maybe you've had a traumatic experience in your life, and that traumatic experience is not happening again, but that's like the earthquake. And sometimes triggers are like emotional aftershocks. The earthquake isn't really happening, but you act like it is. And we're having those triggers. So we just need to be aware of what's going on. So we're identifying unhealthy patterns or communication. We're recognizing the physical feelings, the thoughts, the emotions. And then we retrace the origin of the negative thought pattern back to the origination of the core belief. Now, you might want to do this with somebody, because for a lot of us that can be very traumatizing. The trigger can set us off and we're not quite sure how to deal with it, right? But let the Holy Spirit guide you. And some of these original core beliefs might show up in a scene from your childhood, from your growing up, from an experience that you've had. And they're going to probably be things like, I'm unwanted, I'm unlovable. That's going to be the core belief at the root of it. People abandon me. I must perform for love. I must make God happy. It's dangerous to ask for what I need, right? It might be something like, life is hard and I'm just a worm. It could be, God is a hard taskmaster. We don't even realize it's down there sometimes, friends. And then we get attracted to groups that simply affirm that belief. We're going to reset. We need to reset an appropriate new core belief in our heart, such as mine: I am wanted, I am lovable, I am enough, right? And then we're going to reestablish that core belief through repetition and application until it becomes our new normal. And we need to bring ourselves out of the influences that keep reestablishing the old core belief. We're going to have to be responsible. If you're in a situation or an environment, whether you can physically do it or whether you just have to mentally and emotionally do it, you're going to have to bring yourself into constant alignment to reestablish your new core belief. And it takes some practice, but we can do it. It takes courage to love yourself. It takes courage to come home to yourself so that we can truly take a wholeness into our relationship with the Father, who never looks back, who's always embracing us with an unconditional love. And when we can recognize and identify those core beliefs, right, that are keeping us from experiencing the joy and the peace, we just recognize them. We ask ourselves, okay, where's that coming from? Deal with the root, replace the belief, and establish that belief with practice and application. So, too many of us have done what John O'Donohue says, we've traveled too fast over false ground. Now your soul has come to take you back, he says. And this is the true awakening. And we're arising to our place, which is seated with Christ in the heavenly realms. God bless you. I love you so much. Thank you for hanging with me today.